Greetings, ladies and gentle cucks, thoughts and hoes, and all the shits at sea. It is I, obviously, Jesus, here with your first Patreon video for the month of December 2018. Already in the last month of the year. It feels like time has flown by, and mostly because it did. It killed me in a drive-by shooting a long time ago. But anyway, I'm obviously Jesus, and as you can probably tell if you are literate, today's video is entitled A Life Without Motivation, and I struggled to come up with a topic for today because I've talked about pretty much everything, and even this video, everything that occurs to me on a regular basis in life, I should say, unless there's something that I thought of once or twice that I didn't write down to my detriment. But, you know, I talk a lot about the same stuff, and everything kind of interweaves, and even this video is going to interweave into the sort of antinatalist stuff that I've also talked about previously, as well as my thoughts and my experiences in education. But what I wanted to do in, talking about motivation today is examine my life and describe what it's like to live a life entirely devoid of motivation, and trace exactly how I got to this point in my life and what exactly happens in my head when I try to get into something and get motivated to do something other than just sitting around my house and, playing video games and eating a lot and doing basic low-level operations to keep myself alive. So anyway, we're going to talk about that, and I hope it's not too much of a rehash. I'm going to try to, I have my notes here. I certainly did my best to avoid rehashing old stuff, but, again, as I've said in previous videos, my whole point, or one of the points of this Patreon project is to tie together, not necessarily a theory, but like an experience of what it's like to live life in this way, or in the way that I'm doing with the particular brain I have, in order to be hopefully more understood someday by whom I don't really know. But, that said, of course, please do continue to send your suggestions in comments for the videos. I know I was actually looking at Frank Yang a very, very long time ago. Joe Hart, who is a patron to this day, suggested I look up a guy named Frank Yang. So, Joe, if you're out there and you see this video, or if you or if anybody else is familiar with Frank Yang's work who wants me to rebut any kind of, or talk about any kind of videos that he makes, then please do send me a specific video and I'll try to respond to that. Maybe I'll do one or two if they're particularly short. I did watch one that he made fairly recently about veganism, and I honestly couldn't tell if it was a joke because the editing and like the trappings of the video were so strange, and then there was this like weird female voiceover that seemed to be espousing the actual opinion of the video, but I couldn't really tell in all the weirdness if it was meant to be taken entirely seriously or entirely at face value. So if anyone has more context to provide, be it Joe or somebody else, please do let me know, because I'm definitely sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel here for suggestions. Not to say that yours are bad, they're just ones I pushed down because I wasn't like familiar with them, and I'm still kind of not. But yeah, if you want me to look at Frank Yang, give me like a specific video, please, to respond to, and I will look at that and give you my thoughts on that if that's still something that you're interested in, or Joe or anybody else, that is. But anyway, in this video, I'm just going to talk about what it's like to live a life without motivation, how I got there, and what goes on specifically in my head when I try to run through the very logical processes of telling myself to do something like exercise. So we'll examine all that in due time. So, in general, just to start off, in general, I see the state that I'm in without motivation as like the ultimate conclusion of my philosophy of life, which, as I've said in pretty much every video here, is simply the philosophy of avoiding pain. If I do not invest myself into anything, then I cannot become either hurt by it, alienated from it, disappointed in it, and this applies both to occupations and hobbies and things, as well as people and relationships. Even when I play video games, it's kind of funny, actually. Like when I play Fortnite, which I consider myself fairly good at, and it's probably, considering myself that way is probably like a detriment to myself in the end. When I play, I'll usually stop playing after I get a nice win or a nice win streak, because, especially if I'm not playing with somebody else who makes the experience more enjoyable. If I'm just playing solo by myself, I almost become afraid. Like, afraid isn't exactly the right word for what I experience, but I sort of become pseudo afraid of losing after I'm on a heater or after I'm feeling good about my performance, because then I become afraid that I will lose and become disappointed in the game and myself, or that I'll just get angry. And I decide very often when I'm playing by myself, especially, like I said, to just completely eschew that from my life entirely. I'll win one and I'll feel good, and I find it better just to hold on to that feeling of feeling good about myself, my performance, and winning. And I'll put down the game, I'll close the game, and I'll just derive more mental satisfaction in the end from just sitting with that and holding on to that win, rather than continuing to play and potentially bettering myself and actually becoming more skillful. So in a way, I'm like a thief. I grab what I can and I go, rather than I continue to work at it, progressively, and acknowledge that losses teach me stuff as well as winning. So I'm like a fucking satisfaction thief, and it's kind of pathetic, And then this just all goes back, of course, to the same ideology of wanting to avoid disappointment and pain. And disappointment, of course, is a form of pain, especially if you're a particularly sensitive person to disappointment, like myself. And I've really internalized the sense in general that on a long enough timeline, given enough space, given enough place in my life, everything will eventually come to hurt me, because that has been the truth of my life. It was true for work, it's been true of school, it's been true of my own fucking deranged brain, and of course it's certainly been true of my relationships with women. So there seems to be an inverse relationship then in my life between how much I value something and how much time I give it, how much space and real estate in my life I give it, and how much happiness it brings me in the end. It might bring me a lot in the beginning, but in the end, the more I care about something, the more it ultimately, blows back on me when it all blows up and detonates in my face, however long it takes for it to do that. So, that's my philosophy of life. And, people say it's better to have loved than lost, better to have loved and lost than to never have loved at all. And I am not that person. People who say that must be fucking stupid, or they must have vastly different brain chemistry than I do, because it's so much better to it would be so much better just to have avoided the pain and remain neutral, rather than have a high and an extremely painful low. And the low, of course, what with the entropy of the universe and all, is what you're left with in the end. And that's the one that tends to leave a lasting impact on particularly sensitive brains and not resilient brains. To go back to the origins of this philosophy and this lack of motivation, though, I think it all goes back to when I had a breakdown in 11th grade regarding my summer work. I don't think I've ever, I think I've mentioned this, but I don't think I've ever gone into true detail or like full detail about this before, so I'm going to go do that now so you guys get a little more insight into what I'm talking about. I think before I did mention that in 11th grade, or between 10th and 11th grade, I, was about to take, 5 or 6 AP classes, advanced placement classes, going into 11th grade in high school. And I, at this time I was a straight A student. I was really, into the feedback loop of going to school, doing well, getting praised, and so on and so forth. I really liked that because, as I talked about before, it was really great compared to my home life where nothing made any sense. So I latched on to school as a place that made sense and where I could get praise from adults who were sane. So, obviously, it's pretty clear how that happens and how I came to value school so much. So, I'm just living my life. I've always been a procrastinator, of course, as you might imagine. A lot of people who are like myself are big procrastinators. And, excuse me, I'm trying to make sure I'm recording here so I don't fucking fuck up. But anyway, as a big procrastinator, I had all this summer work due for these 5 or 6 AP classes I was taking going into 11th grade, and I procrastinated, and ultimately, like the night before, or the penultimate night before 11th grade began, I realized that I had bitten off more than I could chew, and that I could not do it. And because school and success in school was so wrapped up in my identity, I could not fathom the idea of just giving up and having to, just say, oh, I couldn't do it, and, I'll just take regular classes in place of the classes for which I can't get the summer work done in the next 2 days. So, or even just, beginning the AP classes with an inferior grade because I didn't get the summer work done or didn't get all of it done. So, I couldn't really fathom, because of how much my identity was wrapped up in school. I couldn't really fathom, doing any of those two things I just mentioned. So instead, I chose to stay home from school. And I was fairly old at this point as a teenager. Like, people couldn't move me, you couldn't like drag me, from place to place anymore. So I literally stayed home from school until I got in trouble for being essentially truant. I had to go to the school psychologist and tell them precisely what the problem was, and I had to ultimately get a note from my actual psychologist saying that it would be mentally healthy for me to move schools, because I was already living in a different school district from where I went to school, and I was just kept going to the same school because obviously you don't want to make your kid leave his friends and break that continuity. But in the end, that ultimately happened to be the best thing for me, I think. And I went to 11th grade. I skipped essentially half of 11th grade, and I picked up in like the second half of 11th grade in a different school that was not particularly far away, but I picked up in a different school. I remember I just went in there one day, sat in class, and nobody really, people paid attention because I was new, but like nobody really balked at it or anything. Certainly, it seemed better to experience that kind of new introduction than have the people and have the peers, the entire peer group that I had been with since, like, in the case of some kids from elementary school, realized that I was a fucking idiot who couldn't do, who just procrastinated. And so that was the story of me skipping half of 11th grade and changing schools because I had a fucking breakdown and literally just did not go to school, adamantly refused to go to school for essentially half of a school year. But yeah, I think this is when that attitude of demotivation sort of took root, because it was such a huge sea change from being extremely motivated and being extremely attached to my schoolwork to having to let that all go for the betterment of myself. I went to a new school. I took less AP classes. I don't even know if I took any in 11th grade. I did go back in 12 and take more APs, but I don't know what I did that year. It doesn't really matter for the story. But yeah, that was when this split happened. And honestly, in some way, now I think that the new environment of the new school and the trauma I had experienced at the old place, it probably forced me in my mind to divorce myself from the notion that academic achievement, or achievement of any kind really, was a main part of my identity. And because that lesson had to be learned so hard, it kind of went overboard just a little bit. I think that in some way this is probably a good and necessary step, of course, because as I became far more concerned afterwards with developing my own self, like my own writer's voice, in being interested in philosophy rather than exactly what they were teaching me in high school and everything, I was able to have a lot actually more healthy relationship with my performance to academic work. I was still basically effortlessly an A student almost universally, but it wasn't like I had to do this now. It was so much less of a thing in my mind, of a fixture, of like a pursuit in my mind than it was before. I actually think that I got a lot healthier in my relationship between myself and academics and my sense of identity. And like I said, I think I developed around that time where I started to develop, in concert with making YouTube videos and stuff, I started to develop my own voice as a speaker and a writer. I started getting more interested in philosophy, and that continued in college as well. For a time in college, I was more interested in my friend group than I was really in my academics, and more interested in extracurriculars like mock trial than in my academics, because that actually gave me, more enjoyment. And overall, I think I just started focusing more on myself and my own internal thoughts as my identity rather than any kind of external locus of control. It definitely gave me a sense of self that couldn't be pulled around by external shit so much. But over time, I really do think that I internalized this idea perhaps a little bit too much for my own good, assuming I wanted a career, of course. Which I guess, I from a very early age, I remember, like from late high school, I remember thinking that I wasn't going to work. But, when I was growing up, I always thought I would design video games or software or something like that. So I do think that at some point I wanted a career, and this probably was a detriment to that in the end, because I completely ceased to value performance as regards academics and work, and that, of course, continues to this day. An early inkling, I think, of this was actually my refusal to take driver's ed, so I didn't have to spend 33 hours hours or whatever the state requirement was in some shitty classroom learning about something that was honestly very easy. I didn't study for my driver's test. I just literally walked in and picked the obvious answers and boom, license. And I will probably be able to drive until I'm fucking like 95 and probably will run people down and kill them. And then they'll just put me in a home or whatever. But yeah, that's probably an early inkling of this idea starting to seep into my brain, because literally 33 hours seemed like such a long time. And, of course, I wound up waiting until I was 18 to drive rather than 16. But, in that sort of short-term way, 33 hours of pain and boredom seemed a lot worse than waiting a whole 2 years to drive, because at least at that time I had parents who would take me around pretty much anywhere that I wanted to go. Now, I think I've spoken about this a little bit before as well, but my only job that I ever worked, like my only actual job, was working very briefly at a machine shop at a company that my dad's company worked with. Not his company, he doesn't own a company, but the company he works at, they work with, the place that I was working in, the machine shop. But anyway, I quit one day from that job. I didn't get anybody, notice, not 2 weeks, not 2 hours. I just finished the day, walked out, and never came back, and just stayed in bed the next morning, because, at that point, my manager, the guy who managed the machine shop, got very, very sort of aggravated and very invested in how thoroughly I was cleaning the machine shop at the end of the day. And of course, I wasn't cleaning it to his specification or to his standards, so that was kind of a little bit of a conflict right there. And looking back, it just seems so alien to me, even now, that he valued this arbitrary level of cleanliness in a place that was not only perpetually dirty, but also functionally the same for him, regardless of whether or not I missed a few metal shavings or like bits of dust or whatever you find in a machine shop lying around on the floor. It's functionally the same thing, and yet he's getting on my ass about it. He's getting, not necessarily fully angry, but getting incensed and getting, dissatisfied with me. So I just quit. Because in the end, whatever I was getting paid wasn't worth the hassle. And, at that time, it probably was also compounded by the fact that, I at that time still probably had a little bit of that ingrained idea of not disappointing authority figures like teachers, and I guess your manager at your job is akin to a teacher more than akin to a parent, so that kind of goes there. So I didn't want to suffer, not that I really cared about what he wanted, I just didn't want to be called out even in private. Like, it's never mattered to me. Well, I won't say it's never mattered to me, but it's almost as bad for me, or it was almost as bad for me when I was in school or when at that job or something, to be called out just alone by myself rather than in front of people. It obviously was a little bit worse if people were there observing, especially if you valued them and considered them your peers. But really, the core experience of being called out and embarrassed is really the same for me, regardless of what kind of audience is there. So that wasn't particularly pleasant either, because I was embarrassed in my own little world there, and so I just left and decided that none of that pain was worth whatever I was getting paid, and I would either live without the money or find another job somehow eventually. And of course, ultimately, I decided to just live without the money. I've also spoken often of how I left college, because I wasn't immediately good at computer science, and I had no way of dealing with not being good at something immediately and still being expected to do that thing. And of course that was exacerbated by having a bad breakup around that time and never having had to try before in high school, plus having no motivation to press on and endure. But all of that amounted to essentially me leaving school, and we won't have to rehash that because I have talked about that in great detail in many previous videos. So it's really no coincidence that this time in my life really coincided with me being very nihilistic about pretty much everything. And of course, like I said, I was going through a breakup around that time as well, so that was no fun. And I think that part of the reason I did break up with the person I was with at the time was because she wanted me to get a job, and I quit my job, and she wasn't a particularly a big fan of me just walking out and not going back. So I had a lot of external pressure that I didn't want to deal with, both from her at the time, my manager, and just shit like that. And then the same thing continued through school. I gradually just lost all sense of motivation because in the end it was truly easier to just give up rather than press on, because at the end of the day, I might not have had, a lot of money of my own, but, I had what I needed. I had food, I had a roof over my head, I had all my basic needs met. So in the end, it was, if you lower your life standard enough, it's generally pretty much better always to just give up and, have something to fall back on. If you have something to fall back on. If not, then I can understand why you might get some motivation rather than, say, actually literally starve. But that was not the choice in my case. So it was very easy to just give in to that demotivation, avoid pain, and still feel pretty good and still have a halfway decent life. In essence, I stopped giving a fuck. The problem is, I stopped giving a fuck not to gain more control over my life. I did sort of gain a little bit more control over my life and a more concrete grasp on my identity, but that was sort of a byproduct of the fact that I stopped giving a fuck about most things in life to protect myself, because negativity in life tends to beget more negativity. I stopped caring about virtually everything except a relationship in order to protect myself from the disappointment that seems to follow literally everything in life. And even, when it comes to a relationship, there was a time after that first breakup, my first real big breakup in life, there was a time when I was not willing to, be in a relationship with another person. It took me, I want to say, like the better part of 2 years to come around to being ready and willing to be in a relationship again, and acknowledging that I had redeveloped my need to be with somebody else and that I had actually come back stronger. So there was a refractory period, so to speak, where I didn't even want a relationship because I was so demotivated. So it affected that as well, although that somehow did manage to regenerate, because that's probably the thing I do feel most passionately about in life, as I've talked about elsewhere. But yeah, I stopped giving a fuck to protect myself from disappointment. And because I did that, rather than doing it to seize control over my own life and gain more agency, I sort of, in effect, just, passively gave up my agency in some ways. Because, as far as I could see it, and to some degree how I still see it, is that, school would only, reflect on me how inept I was and how inept I am. It would only lead, and working would only lead to conflicts with, arbitrary authority figures. And honestly, as I talked about earlier in the video, even gaming to this day only brings me anger and disappointment in the end when my finally, when my lucky streak finally runs out. So, the more I reduce my life, the more I avoid that pain, but also there is the impending sense that my life becomes more empty. But of course, I still have all my basic needs met. So in the end, there is a type of calculus wherein this makes sense and is logical and rational. But yeah, like almost anything, if something is an attractive and effective solution for protecting yourself and you still have all your basic needs met, then it tends to kind of seep into the other areas of your life, because your brain goes, oh yeah, I used this strategy here and it worked out all right. Maybe not the best thing I could have possibly imagined, but still worked out all right. When you have a method of coping that is just basically disengaging, and that works for you because, you still have, as I said, your basic needs met, it does tend to start appealing to you in other areas, in all areas of your life. I get my basic needs done, as I said, but when it comes to self-care in other respects, I do almost nothing beyond the basics. I've gotten fatter, as I've talked about in previous videos as well, and the notion of exercise somehow still remains insane and incomprehensible to me, because I cannot even entertain the idea of exerting myself and enduring, short-term pain of small muscles and other stuff to become even the slightest bit healthier. Like, I'm not really at risk for anything. I don't think I'm technically obese right now, and I certainly look pretty much the same as I did, a couple of years ago, but I have gained a decent amount of weight, and I have to take a little bit more pains to hide it, though I still fit in my same clothes, generally speaking. But yeah, the idea of exercise, though, completely alien to me, completely anathema to any kind of part of my life. I would never pursue that in a million years, and I'm absolutely sure of that. And if this, of course, has the effect of meaning that I am avoiding pain in the short term, but probably causing myself some health problems potentially in the long term, which is the ultimate danger of this kind of pain avoidance philosophy when you apply it to yourself without exception. Because we exist moment to moment. We exist in a very moment to moment sense. So when you have this kind of philosophy, it's much easier to justify the short term approach rather than stepping back and seeing the big picture. Because all you're trying to do in this philosophy is avoid pain in the very short term, and so things like exercising and enduring short-term pain start to make less and less sense as you think about only the short term and only what you're going to be feeling in that amount of time, versus what you might gain in the long term if you're able to sustain it. But of course, sustaining it for a person like me who has been in this rut for so long seems completely crazy and impossible as well. Death and deterioration then are effectively somebody else's problem, their future me's problem, at least more so than the short-term pain and dissatisfaction I would experience by exercising. So whatever health problems I might have later, I genuinely think about them, as somebody else's problem. In the same way, I sort of fool myself mentally into thinking that death is somebody else's problem, or I'm going to find a way out of dying, or like I think maybe I'll find a way out of this body and digitize my consciousness potentially. So why would I bother exercising now and enduring short-term pain when I could potentially have wasted the energy if something comes along that allows me to avoid the problem altogether? So that's my sort of weird, stupid logic. And even though I realize that it's weird and stupid and doesn't necessarily correspond to real life, and I can sort of, when I'm doing something like this, sort of step back and talk about the big picture, there's still just some absence in my brain where even if I look at the big picture, if I spell it out for myself as clearly as I'm doing it to you now, my brain just goes, huh, and has no other reaction, if that reaction at all. Because at the end of the day, my life's goals have, prioritized avoiding pain over anything else. Avoiding that short-term pain is just always going to be that most immediate, instinctual, lizard brain, just basic biological imperative, and that will override even the most eloquent description of life to me as a big picture, because I'll be like, no matter what you say, no matter what any person says to me about the big picture, my brain will always refute it with, yeah, but that will cause me pain now, so I'm not going to do it. And as illogical as that can be a lot of the time, it's still the driving force of my brain from all the way back in 10th or 11th grade when that divorce in my brain happened between my identity and my achievement and success and my motivation in general. As long as that divide remains, and it certainly doesn't show signs of stopping, and I brought some cum for popping, but as long as that divide remains, I will always be this way. And again, it really does not show any signs of shifting or improving or changing in any way. That divide remains, solid in my brain. And when in the past I've become concerned about my weight creeping up again, I've thought about starting to exercise. And even if I got myself to do it for one day, I know for a fact that I would not have the sustained willpower to do it multiple days a week. I just know intrinsically. I know myself very well. I have a very good grasp on how my brain works, and in a way that makes it sadder to fully view the tragedies and the disasters and the pitfalls I have in my brain. I know my brain's pitfalls very well. I'm very knowledgeable about that. So I know that if I tried to get myself to exercise every day of the week, I would just fail. And if I tried to compromise and get myself to exercise, say, every other day or take 2 days off in between, I would like the days off so much that I would just go back to making every day of the week a day off and just rest and feel no pain and be not inconvenienced, because, somehow, even just from a time standpoint, my brain would rather be sitting here doing nothing, just vegging out in front of the computer, than actually doing something, potentially productive, but also slightly painful. And that's just my brain. Like I said, I know my brain very well. I know its traps and pitfalls very well. But I have no idea, no mechanism by which to change those traps and pitfalls. I just have to accept them and live with them, and all the bad stuff can be somebody else's problem. Future me's problem. It's like the fucking Serenity Prayer, actually, but I have a fundamental belief that I cannot even change the things that I don't want to accept, or that I cannot accept, because in the end I will have to accept them and live with them, and that's just the tragedy of my life. I have been so traumatized and have never really had agency over my life from such an early age, not even just talking about that school mental breakdown, but even going back to, my childhood stuff that I've talked about in other videos. I never really had agency in my life, so I grew up just without a fundamental belief in my agency over my own life. And I think that, even going back further, that's probably the key to my current state of living in this life completely devoid of motivation, because, growing up, never believing I had real meaningful agency in my life because I was always at the mercy of two fucking fighting idiots in a toxic environment. And my only escape was to kowtow, although I did it willingly, to the whims of teachers and their arbitrary knowledge that would ultimately be useless in my life. And then I lost that as well in 11th grade. I never really had any meaningful agency in my own life tied only to myself and not some external locus of control. So I think that's probably the chain that runs all the way through my life that dictates the complete and utter lack of motivation that I have now. Because I just... even though I'm an adult now, at least in legal terms, I don't know how much my brain has developed, because even though I'm a much older person now, and I understand that I can in some ways affect my life, I don't believe still. It just seems outlandish to me that I could have such a fundamental effect on my own brain willingly that I would change myself and my behavior so vastly that I would be almost a different person. Like, I don't think I'll ever be able to get over my ex. I don't think I'll ever be able to fix this motivational problem. And that's because I grew up with a fundamental belief that, I never had agency in my own life, because I didn't. I didn't have as much agency as other kids because I had to deal with, as I said, just this complete trap of a house that I lived in with two insane people who were always fighting and had no idea how to be parents. So that's kind of the sad story of my life here. And it's affected, as I said, it's seeped into a lot of other stuff. Like when I've tried brief dips into the world of online dating, I become very obsessed. I become very obsessed with checking my dating profiles until I get so burned out by the lack of results that I get depressed and delete all the profiles in one big fell swoop of just disappointment. Because, that kind of obsession is not motivation. It's just sort of like a manic burst of desperation that dissipates eventually. And the last time I tried, I didn't even get 24 hours. But basically, my entire life has been collapsed now into a need for instant gratification and depression caused by the lack of instant gratification. Even going to concerts can feel like a chore, even though it's basically the only thing that brings me any kind of joy with little to no downsides. But even then, I'm worried about traffic. I'm worried about being in the front row, having to pee and losing my spot, etc., etc., etc. I can turn anything into a prison of disappointments. Because at this point in my life, I am more in need of, things like love, human contact, exercise, getting out of the house, and simply just using my brain either in school, work, or some other capacity than I ever have been. I need those things more than ever, arguably. And yet each day I become more and more ingrained in a lifestyle that stands counter to that. It amounts to taking the easy way out to protect myself from pain, rejection, exertion, and that inverse relationship between what I need and what I'm actually doing to get it, that doesn't even flatten out. It continues to get worse day by day. It continues ever downward, creating a cycle that I can acknowledge and see clearly in a video like this, but have no hope to change regardless. And because one development feeds the other in this kind of vicious cycle, this downward spiral or this inverse correlation, I simply continue my descent. And that's where the video ends. No happy ending, no solution, just my tale and explanation of where I'm at. Your music recommendation for the week is Goat Girl's self-titled album released earlier this year. I only got around to listening to it recently as I try to fill out stuff I've missed throughout the year, which is an ongoing process. But yeah, hopefully I'll have all the stuff in order and listened to by the time the last week of December rolls around. I might take next week off because there are 5 Mondays and Sundays in December. So if you don't see a video from me next week, don't freak. It will be the next 3 weeks after that. Anyway, yeah, that's the video. I will see you next week. As I said, Goat Girls self-titled LP, fairly short songs, kind of akin to the Mitski record that came out this year. Be the Cowboy, also a fantastic record. I believe I recommended earlier in the year. And the singer, she goes by the name of Claudie Cream. She sort of sounds sometimes like Courtney Barnett, but the music has a lot more of a punk edge, like a really hard edge that you would expect from a London band that grew up or came out of the same thing that birthed Shame, whose album Songs of Praise I recommended earlier in this year as well, and will almost certainly be on the top list that I make, whether it be top 25, 50, whatever. Anyway, see you next week. Thanks for watching. Bye.